This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign for a free sample of the first chapter. That's fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign. This episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions, and it's available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 312. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. I'm so excited to bring today's episode to you because in today's episode, we are talking about fertility awareness and teenagers and the concept of when is it appropriate to talk about fertility awareness to teens? Is it appropriate to teach them fertility awareness? All of those great questions. It's a topic that I get asked about a lot, what my opinion is on the matter. And I know that you'll find this episode interesting, and I won't give away our perspectives right off the bat. I'll let you jump into the interview and hear all about it. But in today's interview, I invited my good friend and colleague, Chloe Skerlak, on the show, and she leads period workshops to teenagers. And so she shares what her experience is, and we really get into the conversation around when is it appropriate to bring these matters to teenagers. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. And I'm really excited to be here today with my friend and colleague, Chloe Skerlak. Chloe is wildly passionate about the menstrual cycle. She is a Justisse holistic reproductive health practitioner and certified fertility awareness educator. And when she's not hosting fertility awareness charting circles, teaching charting online, or taking photos of cervixes, she facilitates period positivity workshops for parents and preteens because she believes body literacy is for everyone and at every age. So in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the question of fertility awareness and teens. Should we be telling teens? How much should we be telling them? Should we be telling them at all? I think many of you know the answers to those questions anyways, but that's what we'll be talking about today. Welcome to the show, Chloe.
Yay! Thank you. Oh my gosh. I'm finally on the Fertility Friday podcast. This is like a dream come true. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I'm so glad to have you here. I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about this year. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was the question I always get about fertility awareness and teens. And as an educator yourself, you know, I think we spend quite a bit of time dispelling the myth that it's too much for teens or too much information or whatever. So before we get into all of that, maybe just share with us what brought you into fertility awareness and what inspired you to become a certified educator and do the work you're doing now.
Actually, I think I quote you a lot when I tell people that I started for birth control, but I stayed for the body literacy. And so it was my introduction when I was on a hormonal birth control and it wasn't working for me. And that's when I discovered fertility awareness. And now it's been 8 years into my own practice. And for me, like the natural birth control, that's just the cherry on the top. But like the actual ice cream is the body literacy that you get from charting. So that's that's how I started. And specifically with the youth and the teens, similar to you and all FAM educators, I feel like everybody we talk to says, I wish I would have learned younger. And so it's actually, since I took the Justisse training and since I've been teaching professionally, it's always been my dream to teach youth and to teach children, because I know I kind of started off with what I thought were not the right tools or the right information. And so it's exciting that I get to do that now. And it just so happened that a mother wanted this for her daughter, and I had the opportunity to teach her and her friends and their children in a hall that she rented. And she set everything up for me, and I just showed up, and that's what propelled the period positivity workshops.
That's awesome. And as a side note, I love that you basically called body literacy ice cream.
The dairy-free kind, though, like that really awesome salted caramel cashew milk kind.
Right. As long as we're clear on the kind of ice cream, which is awesome. And so I'm just trying to think of where would be a good place to jump in. I think that just to kind of put it out there, what I've heard over the years and kind of like the question for debate is kind of at what point is it appropriate to teach girls about fertility awareness, and should we be promoting this as a birth control method at what age and things like that. So to just jump right into this conversation, what are your thoughts on that idea of at what age should we be educating women about their bodies, body literacy, fertility awareness?
Mm-hmm. The way I see it, this kind of conversation or a person's sexuality isn't like a phase that they start at puberty or like an age or, where all of a sudden the light switches and before it was inappropriate, now it's appropriate. But I see it more as a lifespan, and it's something that you build on every single day, every single year, every single phase, if you will. And so it's something that you start well before you're even talking to your children. And instead, the way you communicate that with them, with like the way you hold them and touch them and sing to them and teach them emotional literacy and physical closeness right from the beginning. And then even when we're teaching them their body parts, right? That's like probably one of their first introductions to sexual health and sexual literacy and sexuality. And I like to tell people that you should be teaching them the words for, their vulva or penis or testicles or vagina, the same time you're teaching them the words for elbow, eyelash, knee, or kidney.
Well, and it's so interesting. So I have a background in sexual assault education, and I used to go into high schools and educate teenagers about the myths around sexual assault, sexualized violence, and child sexual abuse. And we were involved with training individuals who worked with children. So, for example, we would go into like a preschool and train the providers to talk to children about just basically boundaries and health. And one of the very first lesson was name your body parts. So as a parent, and having had many conversations with other friends who are also parents, it's very interesting to me because I've had conversations with other parents who have never told their children the proper names because to this day, we still feel very uncomfortable. So from the general body positivity perspective, yeah, but then from the sexual assault education perspective, you want to give your child the language so that if anything, God forbid, happened, that if they didn't tell you, but if they went to another adult, I know this is a tangent, but like, obviously this is something that's very important, I think, to get across. So if they told someone else and not you, and they said like, grandpa's playing with my toys, that was an example that I used to use because there was a family that referred to the private parts as toys. So like, if you tell your teacher, my grandpa's playing with my toys, they're like, well, tell him to stop. If you empower your child with the proper language for their body parts and you say, grandpa's playing with my penis or whatever, then the teacher will know what to do. Anyway, so that's a side note, but I agree with you 100% that at very least it starts with just actually calling our body parts what they are.
Exactly. And then depending on, what age they are or what they're even asking, then I was actually talking to a cousin of mine about this last night, and she had said that it's just really important. She's a mom with 2 new children, both very young. And she's just reminded me when we were talking that it should really be child-centered, and that there's no need to like sit your 3-year-old down and be like, this is sex, and this is how it works, and you're going to be empowered, and I want you to know this information. And like, that's not, I don't think that's very helpful either. And so making it child-centered and, speaking at their level and is just as important. And so maybe up to age 3, you're talking about body parts. And then between 4 and 8, you're talking about, your bodies and what your bodies do and how they're healthy, and, how to take good care of your penises and vulvas. And, then at 9 to 13, puberty's coming, and you start talking about the changes. So I also don't think it's about like having this sex talk right from the beginning and loading all of this. In fact, actually, side note, I did that. I made the same mistakes. Like, I'm just learning too. And like, as a disclaimer, I don't have any children yet. And I'm just learning, and I'm just working through this just as much as the next person. And so when I was a fertility awareness educator, I was in my early 20s when I started all this stuff. And of course, just like everyone else, I'm like, oh, I wish I would have known this like younger. Who can I teach? Like, who's the first person that I can like empower so that they don't have to go down the same path that I did? But unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know which one. My eldest cousin, her daughter was the first one to like reach this age. And I was so excited to introduce her to the world of fertility awareness. I think she must have been, 11 or 12. And I wanted it to be really special. Next thing we know it, we're sitting in a Starbucks, like in public, next to the condiment stand. I'm trying to teach her about like estrogen and progesterone and cervixes and vulvas and everything, next to the guy who's adding sugar in his coffee. And I remember her face, she was just mortified. We laugh about it now, actually. And it's great. It's great. But I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about talking to fertility awareness with youth since then.
Well, I think that's such a good point. I think that there's a lot of little pieces of what you said that are really important. I mean, that I want to pull out. Everything's important, but there's no one talk. So as a parent with 2 young children, first of all, like I'm busy. So it's not like I'm going to, every Friday, like pull up a chair and be like, let's talk about vaginas to my boys. When you're a parent, every night in our house, we bathe our kids. And so from the time they were babies, it just comes like you can create an environment where, like you said, you're teaching your children language anyways. You're teaching them the names for all of their body parts. So getting in your head that the penis or the vulva is just another body part. And so you just talk about it like you would the knee, like this is your knee and this is your penis and this is your testicle and this is your arm, is a great way to start. And I would say that when you said kid-centered, I think that what's interesting about that, when you're having these conversations, it only makes sense to have it at the appropriate age. And when you're around kids for long enough, you realize it wouldn't even work if you tried to talk about things outside of what would be appropriate for their age. But kid-centered also means that there's no scheduled time when these things come up. So it's good to kind of have a sense of how you would like to talk about things, like have a conversation with yourself. Because when your kid says, so-and-so, I think just the other day, I was talking to my son and I forget. I feel like, but like things come up. So it's like so-and-so pulled his pants down at school, or like, so things happen. And in that is the moment, right? Like when it occurs, when your kid asks a question, when they hear something on the TV and they're like, Mommy, what is a period or whatever. So that's what kid-centered means. It means that like, as these things come up, you're continually having conversation. And although we're busy and we don't always have time, if you always shut that stuff down because you're not ready to talk about it or because it's not the right time, then you're missing out on those natural kid-centered
teachable moments.
Teachable moments, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some great just general information about, like, I think it guides the perspective of how to start talking about this and makes it a little bit less daunting because it helps us to incorporate just these types of conversations into our day-to-day language. And so then when it does come to, because there's that kind of general things that are happening, but when it does come to actually like educating, so there's a lot of women who are listening who have daughters at whatever age, whether they're babies or whether their daughters are actually pre-puberty or during puberty now, where they actually want to impart all this wisdom, kind of like you did with your cousin, on their children, their unsuspecting children. So when approaching something like that, what, from your experience doing the workshop, maybe tell us a little bit about how your workshops work and what you've learned about how to approach teens from that experience.
I think like the kid-centered part was really important because I feel like reflecting on my experience with my younger cousin at a Starbucks wasn't very kid-centered at all.
In public.
Oh my goodness. It's just, like I said, I'm so glad we can laugh about it now and I haven't like traumatized her or anything. But I think that, well, first of all, with the period positivity workshops, number one, something I really love is that I make it a parent and preteen experience. So I want both of both of them are there, which is really cool, especially because stop me if I'm going on too many tangents, but there's a study that actually shows more than 50% of children and youth want to talk to their parents about this, which blew my mind because, you know, we think that the children are going to want to get this information from their friends or from media or whatever. But no, deep down, they really do want to talk to their parents about it. And so my workshop, I love that one of the best feedbacks I've gotten from it, or one of the most common comments, is that the workshop was great, but like the magical moment was the car ride home. When all of a sudden, this couple of hours that I had with them was just an opening the door to be like, look, this is something that's okay to talk about. And I'm an approachable parent. You can talk to me about anything, you know, and just even just start giving them the words they can use to talk about it, or even just piquing their interest and giving them some questions that they maybe haven't even thought about before. But it's on the car ride home that the parents keep telling me is the most magical moment, and that they feel like, oh, cool. I didn't know how to open the door, how to like begin the conversation, specifically about periods and the menstrual cycle and that kind of stuff. Because especially as I've been just thinking about this interview and what I wanted to say, there's a lot of sexual health and a lot of like, you know, consent and safety and a lot of great stuff that is out there, but not a lot of people really even know anything about their own menstrual cycle. And I'm really going on some crazy tangents here, but I have to set aside a half an hour in my workshops just to talk to the parents about their stuff.
Yeah,
because they finish and they're like, wait a second, what? Yeah. Like I'm learning just as much. And so how can we expect parents to teach their children when they don't even know? Mm-hmm. And so one of the first tips I have where parents come up to me and ask me, you know, whether they're coming to the workshop or not, how do I make my daughter's period more positive experience where it was not like that for me? And the first thing I say is, well, how is your period for you now? And whatever you're modeling, they're going to pick up on too. So you start with yourself, you check yourself first. And like, how do you feel about your menstrual cycle? How do you feel about your periods? And what do you want to pass on to the little ones? And so that reflection, I think, is a really super important part.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a couple of things that I think of as a parent. One of the things is that before I was a parent, I had this idea that I would be able to go into parenthood and everything would just be perfect. Like I could just read all the books first and then I would know everything. And then that's not how it works. So no. And whatever it is that you think, in most situations of parenting, so whether it's potty training, whether it's sleeping stuff, whether it's discipline or guidance or whatever you want to call it, you may think that there's going to be this one conversation or one opportunity to talk about something, but this is a person. So it made me think of the experience with your cousin or your cousin's daughter, because even though you did it imperfectly and you laugh about it, in that interaction, no matter how awkward and how you two left feet or whatever, you taught her that you're a person she can talk to about this stuff. And children are typically forgiving. It doesn't matter if you do it wrong. So like air quotes wrong. So I think there's something to be said for that. And what you said about delivering the workshops and then that opening the door for the parents, instead of worrying about being perfect, you could fully do something like that and bring it up and talk about it in whatever way that makes sense. I mean, you're the parent. You probably know your child better than anyone else. And even if it didn't go off the way you thought, or even if it didn't, even if you look at it after and think, oh, I could have approached that differently, just by talking about it, by being open to it in a accepting kind of warm manner, I feel like you can be really opening the door without having to do it perfectly. So I feel like that is something I definitely took from what you said.
Well, and to tie that back into like what we were first talking about, when is an appropriate time to talk to kids about this? Being this askable, approachable parent starts way early on. And you get to foster that as your child grows and as you move through, their lifespan. And so that's also something that I love, that I get to say that my period positivity workshop does that, but it's just one thing, right? Every conversation you have with your children is an opportunity to foster that and help you to become that askable, approachable parent.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think also, because what you mentioned was that when you're doing the workshops, most of the parents don't know as much about their cycle. I think anyone in this field who does fertility awareness education, it's all the time. There's very few people on earth that know so much about their cycles unless they've been exposed to this type of knowledge in one way or another. You don't have to have a specialized knowledge necessarily to talk to your children. It could be as simple as sharing what your first period was like and what you wish it was like, mm-hmm. and what you would have done differently. And that could have been, why are you talking about this period stuff, Mom? But still, however you do it. So anyways, and so I'm curious about how it's received. I think that one of the challenges that I found when I used to present for teenagers was that, teenagers and like preteens, there is a maturity difference and a time, or what's the word I'm looking for, an attention span limit. So mm-hmm. there certainly are certain things that you have to take into consideration, and just the maturity level and how it's going to be received and all of that kind of stuff. So what are your suggestions for how to either tailor the language or tailor the conversation or structure such a discussion that would take that into account?
A few things. I've ran the period positivity workshop a few times now, and every time I do it, I change it a little bit and I learn something new. For example, first it was too long and I lost their attention, near the end. In fact, actually, one of them, it was really funny. One of the feedbacks the parents gave me was like, I could tell by the end, my kid was like pulling at my leg, stop asking questions. Like, you're making this longer, which is actually why I added that extra half an hour where I let, one of the things I do is I introduce different kinds of what I call positive period products. And I let them kind of interact and do their own thing with each other. And so it's all on the floor. They do that. They get to have a time to absorb and interact with what we just talked about on their own. And I just hang out with the parents so that the kids don't have to sit through all of the questions, well, what is this? And what about that? And what if this is happening for me? And what does this mean? And how do I help them with this? So that's something that I've learned as I moved on, because absolutely, their attention spans are definitely they don't want to sit through all those questions. And another thing that I've learned is, especially with kids, the more interaction, the better. A really awesome resource online, I found these cards that you could print out, and I laminated, and we call it menstrual math, which was actually a nickname dubbed by one of the parents at one of my first workshops. And we use these cards to calculate the length of the menstrual cycle and how the menstrual cycle length changes and why it changes, and how we can use this to predict when our periods are going to come. And what I've noticed is that the more interactive I can make the workshops, of course, the better the kids enjoy it. Mm-hmm. What else have I learned? Actually, you'll love this. One of the other games I love to play or something else that I picked up from you. And it's using something red, like I usually use cranberry juice or Gatorade or something, and pour it into a cup to show how much we bleed during one cycle. And it was just the most adorable thing. I think it was my second or third workshop, and I had a 7-year-old, just tiny. And she was great. And so anyways, they all had a cup, and they're pouring. I asked them, okay, so, between, 3 to 7 days, or how much do you think you'll bleed? And I give them each their own cranberry juice, and they have their plastic cup, and she's pouring it to the brim. And it was funny because I think just a moment later, I had said something like, so we bleed out of our vaginas. And you should have seen the woman, this poor little girl's look on her face. She's like, what? And the next thing you know, I'm telling her how much blood? And she's pouring this cranberry juice to the brim of this plastic cup. And it was so funny. I was kind of shaking my head. I'm so glad you're here right now. I'm so glad that you get to hear from me that you're going to bleed, and it's not going to be that much, and it's going to be great. It's actually going to be awesome. Anyways, it was so funny. Just the look on that girl's face. And as I watched her pour that cranberry juice to the brim. But I like to do a lot of interactive stuff, and yeah, that's how I try to keep them engaged. And like I said, every time I do it, it changes and I get better and better at it. And yeah.
So I think one of the concerns around having conversations like this, I'm not sure if it's just as a culture, we just have not yet got, like, we're just so uncomfortable. It's so ironic because there's all these sexualized images of women everywhere all the time. And there's this huge underground, like, porn, like there's all of this sexual, what's the word, like, for sexual slavery. Like, we have this huge problem in our culture. But yet still, as adults, often we're very uncomfortable talking about this stuff. So one of the concerns then that arises is if I talk to my children about sex and periods and their cycles, then they're going to run out and have sex right away. So I'm not sure if you had concerns like that with the parents. I'm guessing parents that would come to a period positivity workshop are obviously open to coming to a period positivity workshop. Mm-hmm. But what are some of the topics that you focus on for that age group? And how do you maneuver that? I'm assuming that most of these girls, if not all at this age group, are not yet sexually active.
I have a few interesting things I want to say about that. First of all, funny story, because when you said that, it reminded me of another story that I've had show up at one of my workshops. And I was drawing, it was near the beginning where I was kind of doing the anatomy and physiology. And I was drawing a picture of a vulva. And I even started adding like legs, like as if her, just, because I could imagine I'm drawing it. For me, it makes sense. But I'm like, wait a second, I should put some reference points in here so they know what I'm talking about. So I drew some legs to like as if she was spread eagle, right? And I'm doing my best to draw this vulva. And at the end of the workshop, one of the moms came up to me and said, I just wanted to say that when you started drawing that vulva, I immediately became really uncomfortable and thought, what is she doing? Why are you doing that? Stop doing that. That's not appropriate to be drawing a picture of a vulva. And then she was explaining to me that immediately she caught herself and that actually this is just a normal part of a woman's body. And we can draw pictures of vulvas and know the different shapes, sizes, and colors and teach our kids. And she told me that how she had immediately caught herself in that reaction just showed how important it was that her and her daughter were here talking about this. So again, going back to those like sexualized images that like we've sexualized women's legs spread open, and with the vulva showing, like it has to be this sexy thing or this sexualized thing when we're trying to have a conversation about, sexual health and our own bodies and how they work and how they look. And so to kind of segue that into your next question about, what do I talk about and how do I maneuver that? Number one, I don't talk about sex in the period positivity workshop. I think if it came up naturally and someone had a question, I'd be happy to address that and kind of go from there. Even just going to your first approach with the child-centered. Like if it comes up, it comes up. They want to know, they want to know. I'm not going to tell them that's not for you to know now because that extinguishes their curiosity and that's not what we want to do, right? But I'm going to answer your question with another funny story that I read recently because again, I don't have children. So I was doing some of my own research and one of the things I found was one of the first questions that usually a 4-year-old will ask is, where do babies come from? And then as parents or adults, we're like, oh my goodness, this is it. They want to know about sex. I have to talk to them about the penis and the vagina and the pleasure and the masturbation and the orgasms and the contraception. And they freak out because they think that this question is all about sex. But really, in this moment in time, children at 4 years old are really are starting to learn about space and time and location. And they actually literally just want to know where. Where did I come from, Mom? Where did I come from, Dad? And a very, simple, child-centered, appropriate air quotes, I'm like doing my air quotes here because we love to use that word, answer is from a woman's body, from a special place called a uterus or a womb. And then they're like, oh, great. And so it's kind of the same thing when I'm talking to like the 7, 8, 9, 10, I've had up to 11 years old in my period positivity workshops. They often aren't coming to ask me questions about sex because that's just not where they are. They don't care. They're you know what I mean? And so it's so funny that you asked me this because obviously my work is centered around group programs or one-on-one programs with women who are sexually active and who want to avoid pregnancy or achieve pregnancy. So for the majority of my time up until now, my conversations around fertility awareness have been very, about sex, right? You're going to avoid pregnancy, you're going to treat pregnancy, sex is involved, okay? Cat's out of the bag. But so I was really concerned about how was I going to maneuver that in my period positivity workshops. And to my surprise, it was so simple. It was so simple. When we talked about ovulation, I didn't talk about how we ovulate so that there's a possibility that the sperm and the egg can meet, and we have to talk about penises and ejaculation. And, no, it was very simple. It was, we menstruate because 2 weeks prior we ovulated. Ovulated is when egg leaves the ovary. And you were an egg. And in fact, you were an egg in your grandmother's body when she had homed, your mother in there. And that's the extent of the conversation. And that's what they want to know, right? And we start talking about the menstrual cycle. What does that mean? And how do I put a tampon in, And so I haven't found that I had to even bring it up, like that the sex doesn't even come up. And when we talk about, age appropriate or whatnot, and when I talk to 7 and to 11-year-olds, it doesn't even come up. I know I went on a whole bunch of tangents. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. It's important. I think this is why, from a fertility awareness educator standpoint, so I can speak for myself and you let me know if you, concur. But when I because I've had that question a lot, like, do you think it's appropriate to talk to teenagers? How soon should we tell them? It's like, if we tell them, then they'll know that there's days of their cycle that they can't get pregnant and the cat's out of the bag. And what have you done? Every teenage girl who learns about it is going to get pregnant. Like all that kind of stuff. It's such catastrophizing foolishness. So from my perspective, when someone asks those types of questions, I actually, my initial automatic response is like, that's ridiculous. Why would it be too much to tell a teenager? But the way that I look at it is similar to the way that you look at it. If you're talking to a teenager about fertility awareness, I mean, you could even start by focusing on the practical aspects of it. It's important for teenage girls and boys, but in this context, girls, to understand about their cervical fluid so that they understand that it's normal and healthy, what it's supposed to look like, and also so that if you know what healthy looks like, then if you ever did have some sort of UTI or even a bladder infection or yeast infection or something like that, then you would know that this is not what normal is. And I feel like we can focus on the practical things. And also, if you can identify your cervical mucus and you can identify when it goes away, then you can predict your period, which teenage girl wouldn't want to know? I mean, that's the most freeing thing. When I was a teenager, I read YM magazine all the time, and they had what was that section? Did you read it too? It was like, there was a section, it was like the most embarrassing things that could ever happen. And it was always periods. It was always like, someone saw my tampon. Oh my gosh, I bled, and da-da-da-da-da-da. So it's like every teenage girl's, I mean, we could talk about that for a whole hour about period shaming and why would it be the end of the world for your period to show. But in that age group, it just is what it is. And having that ability to look to your own body for this important information, to be able to know that your period is coming so that you have your stuff ready. I mean, that's even a little bit beyond if you're teaching 7-year-olds and 11-year-olds, but at the same time, learning that when you're 11 and 12, before your period comes, depending on when you get your menarche, like these are very important pieces of information that every teenage girl has a right to know.
I love that you said that. And embarrassment and shame and all of these things are catchy feelings. And so, for example, when we talked about like the period shame and why we need to hide our tampon up our sleeve and we need to go to the bathroom, like it's a learned behavior. They're learning that they need to be embarrassed and, ashamed about these things. And so it kind of goes back to when I said you have to check yourself first. And is that what that you're teaching them, that you need to hide these things, that we need to use code names for our genitals, so it all ties back into that, right? But I love that you brought up why fertility awareness is so important for teens and youth, because for both of us as fertility awareness educators, I'm sure we both get that all the time, where it's like, why should they learn fertility awareness? They're not sexually active. And, it goes back to all the things I'm sure your listeners have heard over and over and over again of like, bodies and no practice, why fertility awareness is so important other than just to avoid or achieve pregnancy. And like you hit on a whole bunch of really good ones, like learning that your menstruation isn't dirty or doesn't have to be hidden or you have to be ashamed, or just better understanding how their body works. And to address what you talked about, right, where we're all so afraid that talking about this information is going to make them want to do it more. it's scientifically proven, and we've seen it over and over, that the more educated you are, the more likely you are to make the best decisions for yourself. So more education. Let's talk about it more.
Well, and I love what you said about the first step being think about your own experience and kind of go back and revisit that, because if many of us perhaps don't. I mean, when part of the reason why my group programs are so successful is because where else are you having the opportunity to get together and talk about your periods and your menstrual cycle and the experiences that you've had sexually related to having to choose birth control and negotiate that with your partner. And these are conversations and experiences that we often have as women, but don't necessarily talk about. Even with our close girlfriends, we don't necessarily talk about it unless it's more in passing, things like that. I mean, I don't know. There's plenty of listeners who probably now have these great conversations. I'm sure we've sparked quite a bit of conversations with this podcast, but you know what I mean? And I think that that's a really important thing to think about. What was your first experience like? What was your feeling around periods when you were of that age? How would you have felt if everyone was talking about it or everybody knew? I've heard experiences where everyone in the family is really excited to embrace the period really positively, but the teenager doesn't want that attention and she doesn't want everyone to know. And I didn't want you to tell dad or whatever the case is. And so this is an important and complicated conversation, but at the end of the day, it still has to be, I think it has to be, and it should be had. So I had a few other thoughts about talking to teens and how to kind of approach the situation. And I think one of the questions that I get quite a bit is because I make a distinction between body literacy and just that general understanding. So teaching a girl about her cervical fluid in the general sense, so she has an understanding of what it is, and teaching her about her cycle so that she knows what's normal, and teaching her about her period. There's a difference between that and teaching fertility awareness as a method. Yeah. I think that even knowing that is really helpful for people who are really skeptical about this idea of teaching girls this information. First and foremost, if we teach a girl general information about her cycle, we're not teaching her a method of birth control, relax. These two things are separate. So what do you think about that? And so leading into the question of when would it be appropriate to teach young women about fertility awareness as a method of birth control?
Oh, what a great question. First of all, I love what you said about fertility awareness and body literacy. And I think that the terms body literacy, fertility awareness method, these things get interchanged and used as synonyms when they're not. So I love that you brought that up. So fertility awareness being the practice of, observing and charting your biological signs of fertility, or even just understanding your own fertility, your own body. With body literacy being the knowledge that you gain from this practice, whether that be, what's normal for you, or even if it is how to avoid pregnancy, or what's your thyroid health like, or how do I feel in my luteal phase, all of this knowledge that you can gain through this practice. And then of course the fertility awareness method being the method of birth control that you use to avoid pregnancy. And don't even get me started on all the myths about that. We won't go there. So just making sure that those phrases are clear and on their differences, I think is super important. And goes back to what you were saying about how in the period positivity workshop, exactly what I'm covering is the fertility awareness aspect. It's not the fertility awareness method.
I just wanted to pop into today's episode with a quick message from today's sponsor, Audible. Did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. Now let's jump back into today's episode.
And I think that the benefits that people gain, the body literacy is so super important. And we've already touched about a few of them, of why learning fertility awareness as a youth or as a teen, even as a 7-year-old, as I've seen, is so important. And that one of the to kind of lead into what your next question is well, when is it important to talk about fertility awareness method as a birth control? I loved your answer about the kid-centered, and well, you do it when they ask or when they need it. But here's the beautiful thing. We've been talking about being approachable parents. We've been talking about, sexuality and sexual health and these kinds of conversations as something that you grow through a lifespan, not as a moment or an age or a phase that you have to hit. And so using the language that you use and that they learn to talk about fertility awareness, how amazingly easy does that make it to transition into now the conversation around fertility awareness as a birth control method, right? Because you've already learned. It's like, for example, just like when we take on new clients and, my first hour is just spent talking about anatomy and physiology that they should have learned in sex ed, but I can't even begin to talk about how you can prevent pregnancy with the fertility awareness method without talking about fertility awareness and about your body first. So we need to get on the same page. So one thing that I love about teaching fertility awareness to younger people is you're just giving them the tools, you're giving them the language that just makes that transition even easier. Talk about the method as a birth control. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of cousins, and I love that I'm shouting them all out on this podcast. Another cousin I have asked me a question about masturbation and her younger daughter. And she was really nervous about how to talk about masturbation with her younger daughter. And, does this mean that I have to talk about everything? Does this mean I have to address mutual masturbation or, sexual intercourse, or do I have to teach her about oral sex? Like, what does that mean? And again, no, child-centered, keep it simple, direct answers, or, what do you know about masturbation? But the one thing that I really wanted her to know when we started talking about this is, hey, how great is it if you get to talk to her about pleasure and self-pleasure and masturbation now when she's not even thinking? Could you imagine? I think her little one was like maybe, I don't know, 9 at the time or something. She is not, the idea of putting a penis in her vagina, I don't think is an appealing thing, which on the topic of when this is appropriate, if they say, ew, gross, or are you kidding, that's a pretty good indication that they're not ready for it. And you can always say, you know what? And if you find something gross or is yucky or ewy, you don't ever have to do anything that you find gross, right? Which is another great teachable moment. But again, getting back to what I'm trying to say is that talking about masturbation and pleasure now and giving her that perspective and that even just that language to talk about it now, how easy and how beautiful is it going to be when she does get older and you want to now switch the conversation to, like pleasuring, not just your own body, but what does that look like when two people pleasure each other's body? Because that's beautiful. And that's something that I know we talk about a lot gets left out in sexual education altogether. And it's very fear-based, abstinent only. And oh my goodness, I'm going on huge tangents, and stop me if I'm jumping off too much. But this is actually, we are getting to like the root cause of why I'm even in this world, in this work at the beginning, because TMI, and I don't know if you're on the same page, there's no such thing. But I was like, when I discovered masturbation, I can't remember how old I was, but I was mortified. Like I thought that I was doing something awful and that I had to, pray to God to forgive me and what I was doing. And I'm saying this on your podcast and I love it. But I felt that the more I masturbated, the bigger my clitoris was, and that it was turning into a penis. And that was it was a curse or how like they say men get hairy palms when they masturbate. I thought that it was my punishment, that the more I masturbated, the bigger my clitoris got. Of course, I have no idea. Nobody has told me what my clitoris is, but all of a sudden I'm growing a mini penis. I didn't want that. And so the lack of education, and my mom hates it when I say this kind of stuff because she's like, you're making me sound like a bad mom, Chloe. And no, she wasn't a bad mom. I don't know. Did she realize that she had to teach me that my clitoris wasn't a mini penis? I don't know. But like maybe I didn't feel comfortable talking to her about it. But either way, my own personal sexual education and the way I felt about my own body and pleasure and everything, it started off rocky.
Well, I mean, I would say that so many individuals, women, men, and all people are all, the way that our culture has handled pleasure, it has basically been not handling it. One of my girlfriends, we were having a conversation because I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but one of the things she brought up, because I think we touched on what we were educated about growing up. And one of the things she touched on was that sex education for teens, for boys learn about orgasm because when there's sex education for boys, they're learning about wet dreams and like what to do about it and like erections and all of that. And I think I always think that these are for practical reasons, because then when you're a teenage boy in that development stage and you're having erections in the middle of class, like they're trying to tell them about it. With girls, we're taught that it's straight about pregnancy. So we're like, there's no discussion about pleasure at all. And it just goes straight to like, you could get pregnant, like, and the subtext, and then your life would be over, right? So even that, if you think about the stark contrast between what boys are taught, because the orgasm, the concept of orgasm comes up with boys, but it doesn't come up with girls. And I think it's like the big secret about sex that the adults are trying to hide from the teenagers is that it feels good. I think that's the big secret. And that's the part that nobody tells anybody about, that when you touch the genitals, it feels good. And because when you talk about sex from a logical standpoint of like what you said about like penis and vagina, whatever, like to a child, that sounds like a young woman. That sounds very like, why would you do that?
Exactly, right?
Why would you like, that doesn't make any logical sense. That sounds horrible. Like it sounds just really uncomfortable and strange. So, but like, this is why it's important to have open conversations. And it makes, I'm sure this makes a lot of people uncomfortable who are listening right now, that this is the part of essentially the sex ed that is missing, the part about pleasure and the part about, for girls, like it's supposed to feel good. It's like just to have a conversation about pleasure and all of that. Going back to just the idea of like, when should you talk about the birth control aspect for fertility awareness? Because that's something, of course, I've been asked over the years as well. And I think the way that it's often asked to me is, do you think fertility awareness is appropriate birth control for teenagers? And so I think that condoms are an appropriate birth control for teenagers, because I don't think that it's appropriate for like age appropriate. I don't think we should be promoting unprotected sex for teenagers. I always talk about that because when I was a kid, sex and contraception was talked about a little bit differently from my perspective. And so from what I remember, I went to a Catholic school and it was like, if you have sex, you're going to get AIDS and die. Because I grew up in the 80s and 90s and AIDS was all that anybody talked about. And so the whole condom thing was all the rage. Like it was like, always use a condom. And to protect yourself from STIs, and then also consider how you're going to protect yourself from pregnancy. But I grew up in the time where condoms were presented as a way to prevent STIs and also as an effective method of like preventing pregnancy. And somehow we have shifted to much less talk about STIs because, I don't know, and all the focus on preventing pregnancy. I think that when you're having a conversation about like safe sex and how to protect yourself from STIs and also how to prevent pregnancy, I think that it's completely appropriate to have a conversation about, fertility awareness-based methods and how the menstrual cycle works and how as a woman you're not fertile all the time. And there are methods that allow you to combine condoms with understanding your cycle so that you won't get pregnant. And as part of a conversation about all the different options to both prevent pregnancy and also prevent exposure to STIs. So I feel like there's a place to talk about fertility awareness as one of the ways, like as a way to provide a complete set of information to anybody of any age, but in particular teenagers, about how to manage this whole sex pregnancy thing.
Yeah, I love that you said that. I completely agree 100%. In fact, when I was first thinking about fertility awareness as a method of birth control for younger people, one of the biggest arguments I would receive is, well, that doesn't prevent STIs. And I'm like, yeah, well, neither does the pill. Like,
neither does the I'm trying to remember all the patch, the IUD,
Numa
the
ring,
shot,
the penis strangling apparatus,
even the diaphragm, like no. Yeah. And I think that's why I like to have these conversations about just to be practical, just to kind of get out of our own way about how we tend to think about these things and our fears around talking to teens and young people about this. Because the way, even though I'm a fertility awareness educator, a lot of people are surprised when I say, like, I don't think everyone should use fertility awareness. Like, I don't think fertility awareness is appropriate for every single person on earth at every point in their life, because it's not. There are women who will gravitate to this for their, for a portion of their reproductive life or at certain times. And at the end of the day, like, you can't force anyone to use fertility awareness. You could be the most pro-fam mom on earth. You could have hosted your own period party in your house, and your teenage daughter could still decide to go on the pill for a period of time because that is what she feels is best for her for that time. So we're not forcing fertility awareness on anybody. I think it's just important to have this as part of the conversation. I just did an interview this morning, and the woman who interviewed me was saying that for her, she didn't learn about fertility awareness until she was an adult. And she was saying, I just wish I had known it was an option. Not necessarily because she would have chose it at age 18 or 16 or whenever she started having sex, but because when you know it's an option, then you know. And at some point in your life, you might choose it because it may be appropriate for you at that time.
Mm-hmm. And I am completely on the same page with you when I talk about fertility awareness as just part of fertility awareness method, as just part of the options that you have. And I've always, like, when I talk about it, I always tell people, same thing as you. I'm not trying to convince every single person to ditch the pill and get off the fertility awareness method. I'm just trying to say, hey, it's also an option. It's also an option. Like, the people that come to us to learn fertility awareness are not the people who are loving the pill. Like, no. Oh, I love the pill. I'm having a great experience. The people who come to us, people are having bad experiences and they want something different. And so, like, yeah, let me show you something different. There are other options out there. So,
yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, and so to kind of close this out, I feel like we went, I think we covered a lot. I think that this was, for anyone who's listening, I feel like this is a really informative and interesting conversation. So where do the boys fit in? The boys and the dads? I mean, ironically, right? The girl that talks about vulvas all day long, like every day, I've got 2 boys, and it comes up here and there. Of course, they're well informed of the names of their genitalia. Oh, and that this makes me think back to what you were saying about, like, where do babies come from? So that question has happened all kinds of times. At the time of this recording, my sons are 7 and 4. So yeah, you grew in mommy's uterus and you came from mommy's egg and daddy's sperm, and they had to get together and make you and blah, blah, blah. So but like you said, it comes up and it's and if you actually tried, so as a parent, I can say this, if you actually tried to talk to a 7-year-old and, like, you actually tried to, like, hold their attention for 15 minutes and, like, describe, like, sex and, like, all this information that is not appropriate for their age, they would just roll their eyes and, like, walk off. Just FYI. Be like, okay, I get it, mom, stop. But yeah, so how do the boys fit into this? Like, what do we do? Because I think a lot of people think we should tell the girls this and tell the boys that, but I think there should be some, like, I don't know. What do you think?
I think that despite what kind of plumbing you have going on, despite what kind of anatomy or genitals you have, that it is always beneficial to understand how every body works. And yeah, right? Simple.
Love it.
Simple. And I think that this is having a thought that's just coming up right now, but even the way that we separate boys and girls, like when I was growing up and I was having sex health, it was like girls in this room, boys in that room. It's almost the same kind of messaging we give when we're coding the names of the body parts. Like, oh, we're going to talk about something really super secret, and, you know, you can't know about them and they can't know about you, and we need to hide these things from one another. And versus if we did it all together, then yeah, everyone gets all of the information. And it's really interesting because just on the male perspective, both not in just the children, but even in the parent, I've had lots of questions about, okay, so I did the period positivity workshops for these young girls. When are you running the one for young boys? And can young boys come? Or I'm a mother, can the father come instead of me? And what does that look like if, like, yeah, if instead of the mother accompanying the child, what would it look like if a father did? And that's one of the reasons why when I first started running these workshops, I called them a workshop for mothers and daughters. And then I changed it. By the time I ran it a second time, I changed it to parent and preteen, because that is a value I hold. And I think that despite what, sex you are, despite what your gender is, you should have access to this information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And when you pose the question of, how would it look, or what would be different if the father came, I thought it would be the exact same. That's what I thought, because I was picturing it and I'm like, no, it would just be the same. The difference being that the father wouldn't, depending on gender identities, etc., a bio-male father wouldn't have the experience of having his first period to share with his daughter or to be reflecting on that. But largely, it would just be exactly the same. I did have a thought that I just want to get your thoughts on when you were talking about combining the workshops, because I was thinking about it. It's so funny. So this is really bringing back memories for me. So I'm actually picturing my junior high school right now, and I'm picturing the room that they took us into, where they pulled out, it was actually one of my classmates, his mom, that did this, and she pulled out a bunch of different pads, and we were in the room there and the boys were separated. So I'm actually fully transported back to circa 1990, whatever. So my question out of that, though, is that when I thought about it, I was like, well, if you had the boys in there, I feel like there'd be so much giggling and all that kind of stuff, because at the end of the day, a preteen boy is not that mature. It just is what it is. So I could totally see teachers being like, look, you don't live in my classroom. That wouldn't work. We separate them for a reason. And then I thought, but they still need to have that information. How different would it have been in my school if we had just had pads and tampons on the table and we would have just all talked about what they are for and really made it clear that we don't get to shame girls and make fun of girls because this is as normal as going poo, and then they would all laugh. But then I thought, what if we separated the class into smaller groups, not by gender, but just based on, because that would be more practical to actually have the teacher get their point across in a smaller group. And that, I'm just literally leading you down the train of thought that I went through when you were talking.
That's great. I love that idea.
Because I was really trying to figure this out. I was like, you know what? I do see the point of separating, but more so for the size. Because then if you had a smaller, more manageable group, and also this comes from experience teaching. And this is the thing, I spent many, many hours. Sometimes we do 5 presentations in a day. So it was so interesting. When we would do the presentations to the junior high, so the baby teens, the class times were 45 minutes. So we would always have to modify the presentation. And at that 45-minute mark, they're all climbing the walls, ready to run off. But even the high school has a longer attention span. So we were able to actually do a 90-minute presentation for the high school kids. But even so, there's a ton of immaturity. I don't think it really matters. I think you still need to give the information. You just have to find a way to deliver it and call them out. When they laugh, say, yeah, it is funny. It's super uncomfortable. We're laughing because we're uncomfortable, and just keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways.
And that's okay. Yeah. And that's okay. I was flipping through a library for books to talk about this kind of stuff. And one of the titles that I loved is Sex is a Funny Word. Yeah, it is. Yeah. Okay, what else?
Penis is also a funny word. I mean, who came up with that? And vagina, these words, it could have been something else. Oh, Chloe. Well, to kind of wrap up our discussion today, for the listener who's kind of followed us along through this whole conversation and is really intrigued and, possibly thinking about how they can bring this knowledge to their own family, their daughters, cousins, sisters, whoever in their life, what, if anything, would you want to leave them with?
Mostly, I feel really strongly about doing your own work first and being an approachable person, an approachable parent, and how you foster that through their whole lifespan, not through one moment. And a really big message I just want to end with and get across is that fertility awareness is a life skill that should be practiced well before it has to be used to achieve or avoid pregnancy. And that talking openly about sexual health and body literacy is the best way to raise your children with a body-loving, health-centered, value-focused, empowered view of their sexuality and the sexuality of others.
Well, isn't that amazing? Thank you. Yes, and go. Everybody go and change the world now. Thank you for listening. Well, Chloe, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been just so great, and I'm really excited to share this with everybody. Where can our listeners go to learn more about you and what you do?
You just Google Chloe Skerlak and I'll come up. My website.
Skerlak. I wouldn't know how to spell Skerlak if I didn't know you.
Yeah, Chloe. It's also CH. It's not Chloe Kardashian. So it's CHLOE. And Skerlak is SKERLAK.com. You'll find my website. Put it in the Instagram. You'll find pictures of my cervical mucus. Put it in my Facebook. You'll find, my latest favorite article. So yeah. I love to be connected. So thanks so much for having me on the show. Like I said, I've been following you, since forever. And it is just, I'm so honored to call you a friend and a colleague. And it is a dream come true to be on your podcast. So thank you. Thank you so much.
You're so sweet, Chloe. Yes, we've known each other for a while. So yeah, I'm really happy to have you on the show. We will link your website and the information about your period positivity workshops on the show notes page. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/312. I hope that you enjoyed my conversation with Chloe today. It was such a treat to have her on the show and to have an opportunity to talk about the possibility of introducing fertility awareness to teenagers. Is it right? Is it not? Does it make sense? And of course, from my perspective, after having a long time to really think about this and imagine how different the world would be if we just introduced the concept of body literacy and fertility awareness and cycle tracking at a young age. I mean, I can really only see the benefits because I feel that information is power, and learning about this amazing part of ourselves as women, learning about the menstrual cycle and ovulation and how it plays into not only our fertility, but our creativity and our energy, and how our energy can shift throughout our cycle at different times, and how understanding that and leaning into that can give us a deeper connection with our own selves and a deeper understanding of who we are as humans. I feel that there's such an amazing opportunity there. And I love giving the example of, imagine if we taught young girls this before they had their first periods, so they could actually start to understand about mucus and potentially see their mucus and know that their first period is coming, so they weren't surprised by it. I feel that this is completely possible. There are a small number of women on the planet who have had that experience because their mothers or caregivers were sharing that information with them. And I really see this as a positive, amazing opportunity for us to educate the next generation of girls. And for those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll know that I have 2 boys, so I don't get to impart this on a daughter. But of course, my sons will have all of the knowledge and information because I can't help myself. But this is really what I see. This is part of the vision, this vision of empowerment through knowledge and education about our bodies. And it's interesting because when you teach fertility awareness like I do, I'm teaching this general concept. I'm teaching you how to track your own cycle. Once you learn how to track your own cycle and how to interpret signs, your body takes over the teaching and begins teaching you. So really, this is like a door opening to this whole other way to get to know yourself. And at the end of it, you have such an incredible, deep connection to your body that is unique to you. And what I found comes out of this is this huge sense of empowerment that can take you throughout your whole life. And anytime that you have a health issue or you have something that's happening with you, it just really enforces the empowerment piece. So if you've been charting your cycles for a long time and you notice something's off, and because you've been charting your cycles for a long time, that this is unusual for you. When you go to a healthcare provider, if that healthcare provider says, oh, it's nothing, whatever, you know that it's not true because you have the information, because you're so connected to your body and you've been tracking your cycles and you know what's normal for you, that this knowledge helps to empower you. It helps you to advocate for yourself and stay true to yourself and really get to that point where you realize that you know more about your body than any health professional ever will, because you live in your body. So I see this as something so much greater than just charting, because I see how it can affect lives. So with that said, I do hope that you enjoyed our conversation. You can tell I was really excited about it, obviously. And I'm thrilled that you joined us today. Thank you so much for being part of the Fertility Friday community and for sharing this episode with your friends. If you know somebody who you feel would benefit from today's episode, make sure to share it with them. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/312. And with that, I will let you go. Have an amazing weekend, whenever you're listening to this episode. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.